excited for that. Possibly. There we are. Wonderful.
All right, so this is Judy Canale. I'm going to start us off, and appreciate y'all being here. As you can see, our presentation is called Therapy Without Borders, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So it's no secret that medicine and medical interventions have come a long way and continue to vastly improve on an almost daily basis. This has impacted the lives of those with life-threatening injuries, such as TBI, by extending their lives, and therefore, it's also impacted how we treat these folks therapeutically. While money and attention has been focused on the acute care response, we cannot disregard the long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries. The consequences of TBI are debilitating and persistent, especially if left untreated or are only partially treated. Remember, the aim of rehabilitation should be to improve physical, cognitive, and psychosocial functioning, to foster independence, and to facilitate community integration. The survivor was given quantity of life in the acute care setting, and what we're going to focus on today is helping the TBI survivor and their family and caregivers restore quality of life. Let's talk a minute about the 4 primary choices of discharge locations for the TBI client after the acute care setting. I realize that on this slide, it mentions only 3, but I'm going to throw in a 4th. The first one, inpatient rehab, would really be the most ideal, but it's also the most expensive. In many states, health insurance policies don't pay for TBI care, and workers' comp, as most of you know, they're going to limit the amount of money that they can pay as much as possible. So while it's a great option, it's usually just a short-term option. SNFs, or skilled nursing facilities, I think we could all agree are just really an all-around bad choice. Back in the 80s and the early 90s, SNFs' focus was more on general rehabilitation, but now they really focus more on short-term options like knee replacement surgeries and so forth, or they are basically a long-term housing option, but they're not equipped to handle clients with TBIs. Home with the caregiver, this is actually one of the toughest choices, but probably the most realistic for many of the clients with TBI. Home being an option means that we really have to take into account proper training for the family and caregivers, and we have to take into account their quality of life as well as that of the TBI client. We also have to focus on support for these families and caregivers. And finally, the 4th choice, which is not listed on this slide, would be the group home setting. AFLs, or alternative family living situations, is a type of residential support that's growing as an option for TBI survivors. But it's like ICF-MR group homes. It began as an alternative support for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And while they serve this population well, they should not be considered a viable option unless they specialize in TBI. And we do have more and more of those popping up now. But whatever the discharge setting may be, treatment ideally should be extensive and functional in order to achieve the best outcome. Okay. So nearly all the clients suffering TBIs demonstrate deficits in the area of executive functions. Okay. Executive function refers to the mental capacity to engage successfully in independent and purposeful self-serving behavior. And it involves, among other things, initiation, planning, setting goals, monitoring your own performance, anticipating consequences, and responding flexibly, demonstrating the ability to adapt. These have traditionally been addressed in quiet settings, in one-on-one, using repetitive drills and graded exercises. And the goals are generally written in such a way that the client needs to achieve an accuracy rate of 80% or more in order to move on to the next step. So this approach is referred to as restorative therapy, which has a bottom-up approach. And this means that the starting point of your treatment is actually with the easiest tasks, and then they eventually become increasingly more difficult as the client meets the proposed accuracy rates. So while these exercises and tasks have been proven to be effective, but it requires a significant amount of time to get to a point of independence. And let's face it, time is of the essence, especially when insurance is concerned. And more importantly, there's little carryover or generalization to functional activities of daily living. So the clients that I work with are adults with TBI. And generally speaking, the last time they ever sat down to perform repetitive drills was in probably middle school, and they didn't like it then, and they generally speaking don't like it now. I've worked with children as well, and I can assure you that they tire of it quickly too. So because of this, clients may be less likely to engage fully or to be compliant with your treatment plan. So anosognosia, most of the clients with TBI suffer from anosognosia to some degree. And anosognosia is a phenomenon whereby the injured person is unaware or denies any neurological or even physical deficit that is clinically evident. I worked with a client who had significant physical and cognitive impairments due to his injury. He actually had extensive injuries to his eye and his ear on one side of his face, and so there was significant scarring. He wore a breastplate, but if you asked him what had happened to him, he would tell you he cut himself shaving, and that he always wore a breastplate. You know, that was nothing new, because he had a severe case of anosognosia. He could not identify the fact that he had an accident or that he had any physical or cognitive deficits. So if your client suffers from any degree of anosognosia, he or she will probably be less likely to engage in tasks such as repetitive drills because they won't recognize their own deficits, and therefore they're not going to see the value in the task. In fact, they may actually become incensed or offended, and it may actually cause some behaviors. However, if you engage the client in meaningful functional tasks, you're more likely to increase the client's compliance with treatment. You will be better able to establish rapport and get the client to buy into the treatment plan because, as you know, or should know, rapport is one of the most important elements in successful treatment. And in the case of severe anosognosia, you can enable the client to address deficits unknowingly. They won't actually realize they're in treatment, but rather they'll think they're helping you to sweep the floor or fold the towels, and that leaves them with a sense of purpose that we all strive for. So what does community integration look like? It's actually unfortunate, but I can't tell you how many therapists have asked me what I'm doing in the gym as a speech therapist with my client, because that's strictly for PT, right? Or is it? The purpose of cognitive therapy, which is what speech therapists do, is to increase self-confidence, self-efficacy, and self-awareness. Well, this is achieved by retraining previously learned skills and residual abilities, teaching the client compensatory strategies, making environmental modifications, and thereby increasing their ability to perform their daily functional tasks. So in the gym, I'm working on their recall of their workout regimen, their ability to read and follow directions on the machine, their safety awareness with the equipment, their planning, sequencing of their repetitive movements, their focus and attention, their ability to socialize appropriately, among other things. So remember executive functions. It involves organization, planning, sequencing, processing visual auditory stimuli, initiation, attention, working memory, and adaptability. Well, this is an ongoing process that occurs throughout the day in a variety of settings ordinarily. And these skills can be addressed at home, in a store, in a gym, a park, or wherever. And oftentimes the goals that are set by me as a speech therapist actually overlap with the OT goals and the PT goals, and they should. Because when you're trying to teach a goal in complete isolation, you're really extending your treatment plan beyond what it should be. We don't necessarily, when we're working on something like attention, to try to work on that in isolation doesn't make sense, because throughout your day, you're going to be paying attention or dividing your attention while doing other tasks. And those tasks are probably physical, or they may be actual functional ADL tasks. So there's overlap between all three disciplines. So if you're a PT, don't be afraid to combine cognitive tasks with physical activities. And as a speech therapist, I often combine OT and PT tasks into my sessions. You want to collaborate with your team, and if you can, work together in real time. So what I've just described is a method of treatment referred to as compensatory therapy. It deals with treating deficits using functional tasks that addresses multiple higher order deficits at once and allows for greater generalization across a variety of tasks and settings. Now, I realize it sounds as though I'm choosing compensatory therapy over restorative therapy, and I assure you I'm not. I am, in fact, recommending that we combine the two strategies in order to elicit a greater therapeutic outcome. Studies have shown that new neural pathways can be formed through stimulation of preserved skills, and this is what we refer to as neuroplasticity. And combining both of these strategies will allow the client to experience success sooner, which will make them more likely to buy into the treatment plan, which, as we all know, can be compared to a marathon and not a sprint. So we're looking for long-term solutions. So rather than sit in sterile environments trying to engage the client with the TBI, we prefer to go out into the community and do our treatment there because, let's face it, it's the most natural setting for any client. Natural preserved skills, such as social skills, may not be observed in a clinical setting and are more likely to appear when you're out in the community. Natural physical settings are where strengths and deficits can be observed more readily and naturally than in a clinical setting. So I mentioned focusing on the psychosocial aspect of treatment and the importance of socialization. We all would admit that socializing with peers brings us a tremendous amount of enjoyment and personal satisfaction. And that's true for the TBI survivors as well. Don't underestimate the power of a support group made up of folks who have experienced what you have. So we have gotten together and created a coffee club that we meet once a month. Prior to the pandemic, we were meeting at a Barnes & Noble, and we started out with just a few clients, and it quickly grew. Our last meeting, as I said, just prior to the pandemic, we had about 30 people at our Barnes & Noble, at our club. And we get emails constantly from the folks who have come who want us to continue doing this, because when these folks with TBIs get together, they get to share their stories, they get to socialize, they laugh, we do some problem solving, cognitive skills while we're there, but they get to be amongst people who are not going to judge them, who rather are going to help hold them up, enjoy their company, and this is probably the most therapeutic activity that we offer. So let's talk about COVID-19. Clearly, we've all suffered the impact of coronavirus. I just said that we have our coffee club prior to the pandemic. It cut into a lot of our social activities, and nobody, felt that impact more than the client with a TBI. We haven't been able to access all the places we used to go to, like the restaurants and stores and gyms. And this has actually affected their structured daily workout routines, which makes a big difference to them. And the families, of course, are greatly concerned because the TBI population is naturally at a higher risk for contracting the virus. And don't get me started on masks. While I absolutely agree we all need to be wearing masks, it does limit facial expressions and therefore it affects social cueing. They can be uncomfortable, which could actually cause some behaviors. They're difficult for the clients with auditory deficits. Imagine trying to read lips while people are wearing masks. They're also difficult for clients with speech deficits. I think we've all probably found ourselves having to repeat ourselves because it's frankly hard to communicate with a mask over your face. So this has greatly impacted all of us. And the pandemic has also affected everybody's morale. Folks are short-tempered, they're anxious, they're irritable, and this is actually makes it very difficult for clients with TBI. It's actually difficult for them to process all of the dynamic information coming at them through their families, their caregivers, TV, social media. And clients don't get to see folks smiling, and this affects their morale. But all is not lost. What we suggest is that you start with education. Try educating the clients and their families, but keep in mind that the information about this virus is changing on almost a daily basis. So you need to be mindful of how much the client can process. And you also need to be empathetic to the clients and the caregivers' needs and their fears and their anxieties. You also want to be creative and employ functional but fun tasks, maybe at home more. Perhaps, you could have a project where you have your client look up how to build a birdhouse, gather the materials. You may not even be able to take